We're going to be taking a look at American imperialism, and it's going to start off heavily focusing on the Spanish-American War, simply because that's where we kind of first imperialized. We've expanded out of expansionism and are entering in the era of imperialism. So I will detail the difference between the two momentarily, but to begin with, let's define imperialism. It's a policy of extending a nation's authority over other countries by economic, political, and military means. We might exert power over one of these areas or all three. In fact, it's kind of hard not to kind of encompass all three, because if you're taking over their economy, there's a political standpoint to that, and usually you need your military to get involved with that. This little picture down here with the eagle I think is great. It's indicating only 1898, which is when the Spanish-American War happened, but it really kind of just shows that we're just expanding our wings, if you will, all over the world to exert some sort of control. We have the expansionism aspect. It was the idea, the manifest destiny. Then, basically, in the late 1800s, the U.S. had the God-given right to expand from East Coast to West Coast. It was under this banner that we set trails on the Oregon Trail to get over from the East Coast to the West Coast of Oregon. It was our justification for the Louisiana Purchase and the Mexican-American War, and just expanding all over the North America continent. We, in a sense, in every sense of the word, imperialized the Native Americans, but we call it expanding because it was through war and purchasing that territory became a part of the United States. When we look at these countries for imperialism, we did not make them a part of the United States at all. And here's, excuse me, after the Civil War, we see this happen to the United States. Our frontier ceased to exist. Americans instead focused their energy kind of on finding new frontiers. The closing of the frontier in the United States was a scary thing, and they had a lot of books and poetries and movies, what they were at the time, kind of indicating what does that mean for the United States, because you can no longer pack up and move west because west has been achieved. So if things fail for you in Oklahoma, yes, you can move to California, but it's already been settled there. Like it's not a frontier anymore. So over the course of the late 1800s, economic expansion just was becoming a part of American experience and such. And communication and travel improved and became widespread, making that process even easier. So we're looking at the map here, and this is the United States. You can see Alaska and Hawaii aren't on here because that is yet to be achieved by the United States. We have continued to grow. We just focus on industrialization and immigration. So once we had all this territory and industrialized, it became needed in our sense, the American sense, that we needed to continue to go elsewhere. So the expanding kind of went to overseas in a bit. Some reasons that we use in order to justify it is first economic, and that's what most people were able to jump on board with if they supported industrialization, was economic desires for new market and raw material. New markets, it's very important that you understand what new markets is. It's to sell the American product. And if we have some sort of economic, political, military control over a country, there aren't going to be tariffs on American goods. But the United States can go to that country, I'm going to use Cuba for example, and create a tariff on other foreign goods. So to Cubans now, American products are going to be cheaper than other foreign products. And then that's raw, and then the other one is raw materials. So it could be, in Cuba's sense, sugar cane. We don't have enough of it in the United States. Hawaii is not quite a state yet. We need their sugar cane. But raw material is also the people. They became the workforce, additional workforce for Americans, and it wasn't necessarily, in the full essence of the word, considered outsourcing, because we had some sort of control over it. Then there's military, the desire for naval bases and coaling stations. And in a further slide, I'm going to develop on that one a little bit more. And then ideological, desire to bring Christianity, Western-style culture, and democracy to other peoples, which we call that the white man's burden. So this new level of industrial-fed productivity created this surplus for Americans. And because of this surplus, we needed to export goods onto the foreign market. And at this time, people throughout the world were creating high tariffs. And so, because of these high tariffs, our exports weren't as desirable. And other countries were experiencing the same thing. So, we go through this era of imperialism that most strong countries were going through at the same time. This is incorrect by saying expansionism here. It's what, well, actually, not really, because it did lead us to expand within the United States, but these same circumstances led us to imperialize. Here's another one. I just found this online. I stole it from, well, I stole most of these pictures online, but this is called new imperialism, and I don't think there's much new about it except for the technological causes of it. So almost you can ignore that a little bit. The technology of the day is definitely a lot different than the late 1800s, but there's still, advances in weaponry, and which is the Navy component of it, that these boats need coaling stations everywhere. So we have economic causes up here on the top left, the need of natural resources, expand market, desire to invest in profits, outlets needed for growing population. That's huge. That actually, bullet point there is really big in justifying imperialism. Economies strengthened by an industrial revolution. Then we have political and military causes, bases needed for merchants and naval vessels. We have national security. It's a matter of national security, which is a huge argument that we need it in order to be strong in the foreign market, whether it's diplomatically or economically. We need a strong, at the time, navy, because we don't have the airplane and things like that. And in order for our navy to be as strong as, we need bases throughout the world so that we can recoal and things like that. And that was going to be important for national security and also to protect our economy for the transporting component of it. Prestige on the global empire, strong, centrally governed nation states. We have social causes. That's the white man's burden, desire to spread Christianity, desire to share Western civilization, believe in social Darwinism, there's that word again, increased European self-confidence. So another white man's burden, it was going to help the whole world, which that's kind of like the philanthropic idea, like we are going to be good people by going over and helping, lifting these people up into the world. So just to kind of wrap up there, we are expanding from expansionism to imperialism. It was led by that growing desire for new economies market, which was spurred by our expansionism coming to a close. And then we have Captain Alfred Mahan. He is a Navy officer who became very well known for speaking out about the belief that in a strong modern world, the U.S. must sell their product on the global market. Anyone who's even non-military understands that. And they're like, yeah, absolutely, I'm on board with that. So he would kind of get you hooked with that we need to sell our product on the global market to become strong in the world, sense. But he argued that in order to do that, we need to secure these foreign interests. In order to secure these foreign interests, we needed a powerful navy. And in turn, the Navy would acquire colonies the Navy would need to acquire colonies, not colonies like our original 13 colonies. It's probably better said territories, to have overseen naval bases in order to help this scenario that was taking place. We also believe a little bit more on that white man's burden. Here's a funny little cartoon, that it was our moral obligation to spread democratic and Christian values to people around the world. It was a white man's burden to uplift and civilize the non-European societies. And so these little kids here in the front row, you could see these are Philippines, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, Cuba. Those are the countries that we're about to come into contact with through the Spanish-American War. We have the Native Americans sitting over here in the corner and hanging out, and then the European children. You got Texas and things like that, who seem to be, doing their work. These guys are all out of sorts, and they need the good old Uncle Sam to help lift them. Now, imperialism did not come without its debates. There was definitely some debates. Actually, let me go back. I went ahead a little bit too far. Debates on imperialism. Most whites, most Americans rather, favored expansionism. Some felt uncomfortable with imperialism. Though they understood the benefits of commercial relations with other nations, anti-imperialists didn't believe that trade should lead to domination over another nation. felt it would weaken the institutions at home, it would invite war, or violate deeply held American principles such as self-determination. So here's a really important thing to kind of grasp is as we conquer these other countries and they weren't becoming states of the United States, I'm going to use Cuba for example again, they became territories. And as a territory, they were required to listen to American law, but they didn't have a say in it. And it's like, wow, that's exactly what the American Revolution was fought to escape from, being a colony. And, how can we go and make these places colonies when that's at the heart of how America came to be? That was the biggest argument, is that the lack of self-determination of these, territories that we were essentially going to try to take over. And so we have the Cuban Revolution. So I've been using Cuba as an example because that's where it all starts. Cuba, if you can see here from the map, is 90 miles off the coast of Florida. So when things started going crazy in Cuba, people here in the United States started to really take note. In addition to that, we had billions of dollars invested in their sugar cane, so dollar bills speak as well. So Cuba had been a colony of Spain for an immense amount of period of time now. So even though under Monroe Doctrine, it said, the United States, meaning North and South America, or I'm sorry, America, meaning North and South America, are no longer open for colonization. Nowhere under the Monroe Doctrine did we say that those who have already colonized had to get out. So Spain had control over Cuba for quite some time. The Cuban people, starting around 1865, 68-ish, began struggling for their independence from Spain. Or speaking of, well, of course, they're probably struggling for a while, but they started to speak louder about wanting their independence from Spain. Slavery in Cuba had been abolished, but Spain denied Cubans their independence and rule of the island. So slavery was a very big deal in Cuba. It was it was part of that Middle Passage. Some Americans viewed Cubans' fight for independence from Spain much like ours from England many, many years ago. Others saw Cuba geographically as a natural extension for U.S. territory. Their sugar plantations were a huge interest to the United States as well. Then in 1894, the U.S. imposed a tariff on sugar, a commodity that had previously been duty-free into the United States, but because of our interaction in Hawaii, which I'll explain that a little bit later, we were getting our sugar cane from Hawaii. So we created a tariff. So all the people who were selling selling sugar out of Cuba were now not, didn't have the market that they once did. So in an arrangement, it arranged an agreement with Spain based on this tariff. Sugar prices began to fall, and the Cuban economy was thrust into utter chaos. So in 1895, Jose Marti launched a huge revolution, believing that, well, here's a great cartoon here. You could see that anarchy was breaking out in Cuba, and so something needed to be done. There was some misruling taking place. The United States is watching this. Jose Marti had kind of a smart idea, his plan, although a little outrageous. He felt that, he kind of sat back and asked, why does Spain want Cuba as a colony? Well, they want him because financially it's beneficial to Spain, and it's mostly because of the sugar. So after asking and pleading and begging and crying and all that to be for their independence, Jose led a revolution on the idea, let's burn everything. Let's burn the sugar fields, destroy the mills, and fought the Spanish soldiers throughout the island. The idea was that if we make it undesirable, will they leave? Will they look at the mess that Jose and his people created and be like, that's way too expensive, it's becoming too much of an issue, I'm out of here. Well, unfortunately, that didn't happen. Spanish troops were forced Cubans into re-concentration camps, camps and towns where conditions were horrible, starvation, disease, tens of thousands of Cubans, which was 1/4 of the population, died. the United States is seeing this in the newspapers and through something we call yellow journalism. And they're horrified and disgusted to see what the Spanish are doing to the Cubans. So there's even more desire to maybe get involved and help them out. Americans also had invested $50 million in the plantations throughout Cuba, so they definitely kept a close eye on this situation, on what was going on. William McKinley was elected president in 1896 under the Republican platform, which included claims to Hawaii, the Virgin Islands, and call for Cuban independence. However, McKinley did say he wanted to avoid war with Spain. So one thing, he is not planted in foreign soil to acquire more territory, but for humanity's sake. So kind of like, I'm not trying to get a colony, I'm not trying to do that, and he also just elaborated on that he didn't want war with Spain. He was going to find a way to get Cubans their independence without any sort of war with Spain. So, but things in Spain are going all haywire. So he ends up sending the USS Maine into Cuba, into the Savannah Harbor, and let everyone know, Spanish, Cubans, all that, this boat is here to protect American interests, that the American plantations and American individuals who are in Cuba know that the USS Maine is there in order to help them escape or, protect or whatever you want to call it. So it's, riots are going on, whatnot, and the USS Maine is sitting there and suddenly explodes. Actually, I should show this picture first. Suddenly explodes. You see this kind of picture all over the United States. And 260 American officers and crewmen were actually killed in this explosion. Here's a picture of the aftermath of it sitting in the harbor. So, of course, who's to blame? How did this boat all of a sudden explode? Well, the rumor mill started, and of course, it was Spain. A bomb or torpedo had hit the USS Maine. And if you look really closely at this picture, you can see like men flying about. Like, it looks like arms and limbs and legs are flying everywhere. Just a little side note, later on it was determined, because the boat, like you see here, was still in the harbor. Actually, I think it's still there, that it was most likely a boiler on the backside of the bathroom downstairs exploded, causing this to happen. So there was no torpedo, it was just faultiness. So you see, remember the Maine to war with Spain. So Americans who were maybe on the fence about supporting Cuba in this revolution were now like, hell yeah, we got to go to war with Spain. Government was probably behind such things kind of being advertised and, allowing everyone to believe that quite possibly this had happened. A lot of the men who survived this on the boat were like, I'm pretty sure it didn't seem like a torpedo or a bomb. It was something a little bit more awkward. So after this, McKinley and some government officials we have it. We have the reason to go to war with Spain. So at this point, you have questions you need to answer on Google form. Explain the differences between expansionism and imperialism. Detail at least 2 justifications for imperialism. The 2 that I talked about. If you go to Google, there's going to be a lot more of them. You got to focus on 2 that I talked about. Detail one of the issues Americans had with imperialism. Again, one of them that I talked about. And then, why did Americans feel a connection to Cubans' fight for their revolution? What were Jose Marti's goal when he instituted his plan to get Spain to leave, and did it work? In your opinion, why couldn't Americans ignore the explosion of the Maine? So I didn't really talk about, that in the thing. In your opinion, if you were here in the United States at that time, none of us were born yet, but if we're here, what about seeing that in the Maine, the pictures, even if you were on the fence or had no desire or knowledge of what was going on in Cuba, why couldn't we ignore the going to war with Spain has happened? The sinking of the Maine was on every newspaper in the entire United States. And when kind of reflecting back on what took place, and also now recognizing that it was not a torpedo but possibly a faulty boiler that exploded, we can honestly say that yellow journalism is what brought us into the Spanish-American War and really kickstarted us into imperialization. So yellow journalism came from a cartoon after this guy Yellow Kid, but we have 2 competing newspapers, huge newspapers. We got William Random Hearst, who publishes the New York Journal against Pulitzer, and they need to sell newspapers, and the only way a newspaper can compete is with the most sensationalized articles and titles and pictures. And pictures were few and far between at the time, as you could see in any of these newspapers I'm about to show you. They're mostly made up of words instead of pictures. So destruction of the warship Maine was struck the work of an enemy. And so everyone is just furious, and that kind of title just initiates so much emotion within Americans. And it even says here the warship was not an accident, or the explosion of the warship was not an accident. So this yellow journalism, which pays very little attention to facts and was basically just designed to grab the attention and stir up emotions in the readers, made Americans push in order to have us go to war. So McKinley, he was surrounded by this atmosphere of anti-war sentiment. He still did not want to go to war. He won the elections to become our president based on the idea that he wanted to see freedom for Cuba, but did not want to go to war. So he sent over an ultimatum to Spain demanding an armistice and ending the reconcentration camps. It didn't guarantee any sort of peace. It was just say, stop the reconcentration camps. Well, Spain did not fulfill this ultimatum. And so with Spanish insufficient ability to these concessions, McKinley finally gave in to the public and political pressures that he was receiving. On April 12th, 1898, Congress asked to use force against Spain. They disbanded for about a week, and on April 19th declared Cuba's independence and directed the president to use troops to end Spanish control of Cuba, pretty much amounting to war with Spain. But the way it's worded is, we officially declared Cuba independent. If Spain wasn't going to honor that, they were bringing about war themselves, So Spain responded 5 days later with their own declaration of war. On April 25th, McKinley signed a congressional declaration that war with Spain had begun. So what do we do first when we go to war with Spain because they refuse to acknowledge the independence of Cuba? We send troops to the Philippines. The Philippines was also a colony of Spain, and we are at war with Spain. It's the Spanish-American War. So we've got to take on their fleets everywhere. So before any fighting began in Cuba, war began in the Philippines. Following the February 25th orders of Assistant Secretary of the Navy Teddy Roosevelt, eventually becomes our president, Commander George Dewey also had moved his 6 U.S. ships to the neutral port of Hong Kong and prepared to invade the Philippines. On May 1st, Dewey and his fleet attacked the Spanish squadron in the harbor of the Philippine capital. In 7 hours, we demolished the entire Spanish fleet, sinking all 10 of their ships. When reinforcement arrived, Dewey entered into collaboration when the Spanish reinforcement arrived, I should clarify. Dewey entered in negotiations with the revolutionary troops in the Philippines because the Philippines had also been staging uprisings against Spain and wanting to see their independence. So Dewey says to them, help us ensure that Spain leaves and sorry about that, my mail just went off. Help us ensure that Spain leaves and we'll guarantee your independence from Spain. Well, it was very carefully worded, and here's the Spanish fleet newspaper. It was very, 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 very carefully worded because when the Spanish-American War came to a close, the Philippines did not get their independence completely. They did indeed receive their independence from Spain, but not from the United States. And the revolutionaries in the Philippines, as you can imagine, were furious, but Dewey was like, hey, I never promised you that. So there was a little bit of dirty work going on there. And you could see Dewey and McKinley overseeing things in the Philippines. Once that was wrapped up, we do finally move this war into Cuba. It was very quickly that the ground troops hit Cuba, rushed up San Juan Hill, and conquered running up San Juan Hill, conquering the area. They pretty much conquered Cuba. As you can tell from any map, that it's not the biggest island out there. U.S. troops, including many African Americans and segregated troops, but in the, a part of the military nonetheless, were very anxious to bring independence to Cubans, who many were actually of African descent. Fighting in this area officially began on June 20th, 1898. I'm sorry about that. So the Rough Riders, led by Teddy Roosevelt, the cute little guy in the middle there, these guys were American heroes. This unit is made up of a bunch of rough-ended people. There's polo players, not water polo players, but actual polo players. College students, some cowboys, adventurous types, all led by Teddy Roosevelt. They were very undisciplined. They actually also called him Teddy's Terrors. Not always the most efficient fighter, but they really embodied that American enthusiasm for fighting against Spain, and they were praised and loved by the press. Teddy Roosevelt was not a big diplomatic man, but his leading of the Rough Riders and the yellow journalism that surrounded that actually led Teddy to eventually be the president of the United States. One could probably very much say, and he'd probably say himself, he was not a political man. He didn't see himself, he didn't grow up imagining himself to be the president. But because of yellow journalism and this, he became our president. So when the charge up San Juan Hill happened, it was a huge victory for the United States. And the newspapers celebrated the Rough Riders. But in reality, it was the 9th and 10th all-black cavalry that was on the front line and led the charge, taking the most dangerous position on the front lines. Rough Riders came in behind and kind of cleaned it up. But there was no way that was going to sell in the newspapers. It wasn't until many, many years later that they were highlighted and noted and received awards from our federal government for their work in the Spanish-American War. So 2 days after the battle, the Spanish fleet tried to run from the U.S. blockade at Santiago Harbor in Cuba. It was a very one-sided battle. The U.S. sank more and more of the Spanish fleets, and finally conquering and victory of the Spanish-American War came in July. This was called a splendid little war, splendid little warriors in this one, but splendid little war by a senator. And it kind of became known as that. It was a quite short war if you were keeping track of the months. It was 4 months long. 385 soldiers were killed in action. So when you look at it that way, it's like, that's huge sacrifice, and no one wants to see 385 Americans dead in action. But 5,000 men died of mosquito-borne diseases such as malaria and yellow fever. When the soldiers that did survive returned back to the United States, they were actually quarantined at Ellis Island to make sure that none of that actually broke out in the United States. So these soldiers came back really upset. You're used to, huge celebrations and all this, and they were sent back to sit in a quarantine and hear that the senator was calling this a splendid little war when over 5,000 American soldiers perished in some way, shape, or form in this war. African Americans, it is also needs to be noted, faced extreme discrimination in the United States, because if you think about where Cuba is, in order to get to a port, in order to get to Cuba, those African American soldiers had to pass through southern states. They're in uniform. If you can kind of think about how you might feel if you came across an American soldier, hopefully you feel a little bit of respect for them. Some might feel the need to salute the soldier. But you give them respect. It was very hard for the white Southerners who have such pride in the military to see an African American in a uniform. And so there were some riots that took place and some extreme tensions throughout the South. But again, back to the victory. We were able to celebrate once again the United States once again, and actually we have yet to lose a war in American history. We're the newest country we have yet to lose a war. And so we've celebrated that, but not without some criticism. Here is a political cartoon that you would often see. Things like this. Puck was a very well-known individual for the political cartoons. But we see McKinley here. As you can see, he's getting quite fat, and he's kind of dressed in the American flag in a sense. each line on his pants have a different area territory that eventually, in some way, was conquered by the United States. So we have enlightenment, foreign policy, rationale, expansion. These are all the reasons why we justified it. And these guys over here are trying to give him, if you can see, anti-expansionism policy, his medicine to try to combat his fatness and his greediness. So Spain ended up signing the ceasefire August 12th, 1898, the day before Dewey and his ground troops were unaware that the war had ended and actually captured Manila over in the Philippines. So that was a very common thing. War continued on even after ceasefire was called, just because communication was so slow. Permanent settlements were made by October, and basically the Treaty of Paris, Spain granted independence to Cuba, ceded Puerto Rico to the United States, as well as Guam and the Philippines, to the U.S. in exchange for a payment of $20 million. This new territory added 100,000 square miles and close to 10 million people to the American Empire. So, Treaty of Paris, it said that Cuba had its independence. So right away they got together in Cuba and started creating their own government. Kind of unsupervised and a little bit by the United States, but there was some oversight going on. And when Cuba created their independence, we couldn't believe, their constitution, we couldn't believe that they had not included, had not included the United States in their constitution. So the United States very urgently, without quite saying demand, but urgently said, you must add the United States into your constitution. And we call it the Platt Amendment. And let's just take a look really quick at why Cuba would do that. Cuba wants their independence. They feel like they were a part of the fighting, which they were, a part of the fighting for their independence. They have no desire. Why would they have a desire to put the United States in their constitution? But when we said you must, they ended up giving in and putting the Platt Amendment, which I'll explain what it is in a second, in their constitution because they feared the consequence. What will happen if we tell the United States no? Spain told them no. They went and took all their territories, made their situation even worse. They didn't just take Cuba, they took the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico. And that becomes the trend for the world at the time, is the United States says or suggests this or says to do this or wants this. The country doesn't necessarily want to give in, but the fear of what will happen if I say no. It could be worse than this. So after the war, the U.S. set up a military government in Cuba. President McKinley allowed Cuba to prepare a new constitution for their country, but McKinley attached conditions to the new constitution called the Platt Amendment. It was a list of restrictions that Cuba had to follow that was given to them by the United States. This meant that Cuba was independent but tied to the United States. Causes of the Platt Amendment: Cuba couldn't make a treaty with another nation that would weaken its country or allow another foreign power into Cuba. Cuba had to let the U.S. set up naval bases where they wanted to put them. Cuba had to make their debts low in order to prevent foreign countries from taking their land. And the U.S. had a right to intervene or protect Cuba's independence. And that fourth point, you can imagine, there's no real specification on who gets to say, basically it's up to the United States to determine when Cuba needs protection. Cuba had no choice but to accept this because if they didn't, the U.S. would maintain their military control over the island. And then we move on to the Philippines. McKinley was torn on what to do with the Philippines. He finally concluded that they were unfit for self-government. He felt that the best choice for them was for the U.S. to take the island, educate the Filipinos, uplift, civilize, and Christianize them, ignoring the fact that most Filipinos were Catholic and hence Christians, and they just wanted self-government. So and this is a nice little political cartoon kind of showing the effects after Spanish-American War. And you could see like the Native American over there in the corner and the good little white Americans over here in these unruly countries, including the state of Hawaii, what becomes the state of Hawaii, who definitely needs Uncle Sam to attend to them. Well, as you can imagine, there was a resistance in the Philippines, and there was a war, battles that took place between the United States and the Philippines. The 3-year battle ended in 1901 when the U.S. declared that it had crushed the revolt. Doesn't mean it was over, or that they were independent, rather. And so you could see another little picture here. About 10,000 miles from tip to tip, the United States had this entire new empire to oversee. We emerged from this a world superpower. It's the strongest industrialized nation at the time, strongest economy, and now we are a world empire that stretched from the Caribbean Sea to the South China Sea. This includes Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines, Hawaii, and many other Pacific islands. This also allowed the U.S. to further expand its role and influence in Asia, and we'll see that in a moment. We were not without criticism. I know this is a little bit more recent, but it's a great picture showing what many people felt about imperialism. Anti-imperialist included people from all different political parties, classes, varied on their reasons from moral to humanitarian sentiment, and just plain rejected the exploration of indigenous people. Other cautioned the U.S. to stay out of colonialism and militarism and for fear of what that might mean for the United States, which we see it leads to a war. Here's another political cartoon, as you can imagine, or as you can see, they're very big in the time as well as newspapers, just basically showing how we kind of just select what we want and what good they did for us, and it's basically all about feeding the belly of the United States. Here's also another little cartoon that I think it's great. It's showing the growth of Uncle Sam, or the representative Uncle Sam, and how we started out quite a baby, 13 states. By 1803, we were 17 states. Louisiana was eventually given to us by France. By 1819, we had 22 states, Florida ceded by Spain. 1861, 34 states. We obtained Texas in a battle. 1898, we included now Hawaii, as well as by 1898, Cuba, Philippines, Puerto Rico. And so you could just see a little bit closer, if you couldn't read before, what all those little areas had said. But we have scared many big countries. We've taken things from many very large countries. So you can imagine that when we ask for something, we're at the point in time where they kind of just give it to us. And so we enter into a new era of foreign policy. The next next 3 presidents all have their own nicknames given by the media, for the most part, on their approach to diplomacy. This is Teddy Roosevelt's, and it is Big Stick Diplomacy. Push for greater involvement in world affairs, advocated peaceful relations with other nations, but wanted a strong international presence that would ensure American prosperity. The policy is really summed up by this West African proverb, speak softly and carry a big stick. So speak softly, enter into peaceful negotiations and relations and affairs with other countries, but make sure you carry the big stick. And the big stick at this point would be our Navy. The country with the strongest, largest Navy was the strongest country in the world at the time. His big stick approach manifested itself to include an addition to the Monroe Doctrine, which was the Roosevelt Corollary. So if you remember, the Monroe Doctrine, 1832, said that the Americas is no longer open for colonization, and basically anyone who tries to colonize there is initiating war with the United States. Well, the Roosevelt Corollary basically was like dusting that off, stapling something else to it, and resubmitting it, saying, hey, remember this document? We're still abiding by it. And I want to clarify that the Americas means North and South America. So the Roosevelt Corollary was a little bit more directed at statements to Latin America, because that's where a lot of foreign involvement was getting involved. And you got to realize during imperialism, every strong country is getting involved in it. From 1900 to 1917, when the United States entered into World War I, we used this to justify interventions in places like the Dominican Republic, Panama, Cuba, Honduras, Mexico, Haiti. And then we have the involvement in Asia. Asia at the time was extremely weak. Here we go, extremely weak. And there was a lot of countries vying for some piece of that pie. A lot of natural resources, one off the top of my head is silk and teas come from Asia. And there's also a lot of resources in the form of people, markets, people to buy our product, work for our product type of thing. So a bunch of countries here, you can see Great Britain, Russia, Japan are looking at China here and carving it up for themselves. And China is not happy about it. Well, the United States is seeing what's going on. A little Boxer rebellion breaks out in China. The United States gets involved as kind of a mediating force. Helps squash the Boxer rebellion, which makes these guys at the table very happy because the Boxer rebellion was rebelling against the foreign influence. So the United States then issued the open door notes. Open door policy and notes are used interchangeably. And basically says, hey, if you guys continue to give us these great trading rights within China, we won't try to carve our own piece of this pie. So otherwise, we'd be sitting right next to Japan here and carving our own piece. And most of these countries, we've already beaten. And those that we haven't, we know we could. So they're fearful. That carry a big stick is what are the consequences of saying no to the open door notes? So they gave in and they said, okay. So the reason why we did that is because we wanted to expand and get involved and increase our involvement in the markets throughout Asia. Then there's President Taft. His is called dollar diplomacy. He followed Roosevelt in office in 1909. Encourage U.S. businesses to invest in foreign regions. So the strong economic, using dollars, not bullets, would advance U.S. authority and prosperity while promoting worldwide stability. So if we had billions of dollars of things invested in different countries, which we did in Hawaii and Cuba, we will have some influence over that country, because if they're not doing as we want and we decide to leave those countries, we are taking basically their economy with us. And also what form this took is we paid off the debt of many Latin American countries. So they owed other foreign European countries debt, and they were defaulting on the debt. And so it's always kind of understood, if you default on your debt as a country, the other country has the right to go in and seize something, whether it's industry or just everything, your whole country. We didn't want to see that happen, so we'd pay off their debt. So those Latin American countries now owe the United States. There's no political cartoon for Wilson's moral diplomacy, but he took office in 1913, and he wanted to really help maintain world peace. He emphasized Americans' idea of self-determination, which at the same time it led to U.S. to continue to meddle in and sometimes dominate the affairs of nations in Latin America and Asia when they weren't giving self-determination to their people. Yes, it sounds like it contradicts each other. All right, here are your questions. What role did yellow journalism play in the Spanish-American War? In your opinion, why would newspapers want to push America for war? What's in it for them? So imagine what newspapers make all of their money off of. What kind of stories is it? So what is in it for a newspaper, or today's time, the news, if our country goes to war or there's some sort of big drama? Who were the real heroes of San Juan Hill, and why weren't they celebrated as such? What does it say about the U.S. that Cuba gave in to the Platt Amendment? And lastly, explain U.S. foreign policy in the late 1800s, early 1900s. So what does that look like, our involvement in other countries? All right, well, good luck, guys.